Weak people speak because they are afraid to disappear. Broken people speak because they are afraid to lose control. Both are desperate. Both are loud for the same reason. They do not trust their own weight. But real assertiveness is different. It does not beg to be noticed. It does not bark to prove itself. It waits. It watches. It acts only when action matters. Because the strongest presence in any room is not noise. It is restraint, backed by competence, and the kind of self-respect that does not need applause. You know this room. You have been in this room. The one where the wrong voice led, where the loudest one won, not because of what was said, because no one pushed back. You sat there with something real and let it die in your throat. Or worse, you pushed it out too fast, too much, too soon, and the room went cold. Both moments live in you. The one where you said nothing, the one where you said everything. Both cost you the same thing: respect. Not theirs, yours. You know what that costs, to leave a room carrying less than you walked in. To sit alone after and replay every line, saying what you should have said, to no one, too late. That is not a talent gap. That is a training gap. And the training is not about words. It is about what sits behind them. The voice the room actually listens to is not the fastest, not the loudest, not the cleverest. It is the one with weight behind it. And weight is not performed. Weight is built. Most do not understand this. Most decide the answer is more. More talking, more explaining, more proving, getting louder, getting faster, more urgent with every sentence. And for a moment, it almost feels like power. But it is not power. It is noise. And people feel the difference, even when they cannot name it. You have felt it from the other side. You have sat across from someone who filled every second with words and felt yourself pull away. Not because that voice was wrong, because the need was too visible. The need for your attention, the need for your face to confirm that what was being said actually mattered. And that need, that constant open need, kills authority. Not failure, not mistakes, not being wrong in front of the room. The need to be heard by force, that is what breaks it.
What no one can take is your ability to go quiet and let the work answer, and let your presence fill the space without demanding anything from it. That is what real weight feels like. Not loud, not fast, just steady, just there, just done with proving. You have been in that situation where someone else took credit for what you built, and you let it happen. Not because you were weak, because you did not know how to push back without sounding desperate, without sounding petty, without needing to win visibly. So you went quiet and called it dignity. But you know, somewhere you know, that was not dignity, that was avoidance. And the one who took credit is still taking it from someone else now, because no one ever pushed back. Because quiet without edge is just invisible. That is the truth you have been circling. Silence without skill is not power. It is absence. It does not register. It does not shift anything. It just leaves you out. What you actually want is not silence for its own sake. What you want is the kind of quiet that makes the room pay attention. The kind where you say one thing and it lands harder than everything else in the room. The kind where you do not rush because you know what you have and you know it is enough. There is a version of authority that does not need constant presence, does not need constant output, does not need every conversation to carry its name in it. It shows up when it matters, says exactly what is needed, and nothing past that. And the room feels the difference. That is not a style choice. That is discipline. And discipline takes time to build. The one who must win every sentence, every exchange, every moment. You have met that one. And if you are that one, this is not a judgment. This is a cost calculation. When you cut in, when you rush to respond, when you feel that pull to correct, to add, to prove, what are you afraid of? That the moment will close and you were not part of it? That the room moved on without noticing you were there? That is not confidence. That is fear with speed on it. And it costs more than you think. Every time you cut in, you signal one thing. You are not in control. Not of the conversation, not of the room, not of yourself. And people file that away. Never said out loud, but filed. The next time a decision is made about who gets trusted, about who gets the room, that file gets opened. You cannot unsend it, but you can start a new one decision at a time, one room at a time, starting with the next moment where everything in you wants to push and you hold instead.
So what does it actually take to carry weight in a room without announcing it? Not talking less, doing more. Not holding back words, having something to back them up. When you are actually good, not average, not passable, good, you do not need to announce it. It is already in the room. It is already in how you move, in what you choose not to say. The most disciplined one in any group is rarely the loudest. Not because discipline makes you quiet, because discipline makes you full. You are not chasing the moment. You are already ahead of it. That changes everything. Not just how the room sees you, how you see yourself, how long you think before speaking, how willing you are to let silence sit and trust it is working for you, not against you. Silence from an empty place is weakness. Silence from a full place is a different thing entirely. It is the silence that shifts the room before you say a word. It is the silence that signals something is here, something is ready, and when it moves, it will count. There is a cost to where you are, not just professionally, internally. Every time you leave a room, knowing you performed instead of showed up. Every time you replay the conversation, wishing you had said less, or said it cleaner, or said nothing at all. That replay is not guilt. That is information. Your own mind showing you the gap between who you are performing as and who you actually want to be. That gap does not close by wanting. It closes by changing one thing. Just one. Drop the explanations before anyone has doubted you. Feel what shifts, not in a day, over time. People begin treating you differently, not because you changed who you are, because you dropped the performance and let what is real be enough. You already have enough. You always had enough. The problem was not the amount, it was the delivery. Pushing before anyone asked, spending it on the wrong rooms, on voices that were not ready, on moments that did not need it. Precision. Not silence, not loudness. Precision. Moving when movement counts, speaking when it will land, holding everything else until the right moment,
opens. You have seen it in someone else, the one who does not rush, sits in the room for an hour, says almost nothing, and then speaks, and the whole room shifts. Not because the words were special, because the restraint behind them made them land clean. You want that. You have always wanted that. Not applause, not constant recognition, just that moment where you speak and it counts. Where you walk in and the room feels the change, not because you demanded it, because you earned it. That is not a distant version of you. That is the trained version, the one that exists after you drop the performance and start building instead. And building takes time. You will not feel it most days. You will have stretches where the restraint feels costly, where the quiet feels empty, where someone louder takes the room and you wonder if you called it wrong. You did not. Hold it anyway. Because the ones who get there do not hold because it feels good. Hold because the decision was made. And that decision does not need to feel good every day. It just needs to be kept. The hardest part is the in-between, the gap between who you were and who you are becoming. In that gap, you will feel invisible. You will go quiet, and no one will notice. You will hold back, and a louder voice will fill the space and take the room. And you will wonder if restraint is just another word for being passed over. It is not. But you will not feel that yet. You will have to hold the decision without proof, without confirmation, without anyone showing you that you are on the right side. That is the real test. Not the loud moments, not the easy rooms, the quiet ones. The ones where you hold and nothing changes today. Not yet, but you hold anyway, because you decided. Not because it felt right, not because anyone confirmed it, because you decided. That decision is yours to keep. No one else can carry it. No one else can break it, except you. How many years? Carrying what you can do and struggling to make it visible. Not because it is not there, because you were showing it wrong. Through words, through volume, through constant presence. When what it needs is precision. One move at the right moment hits harder than 100 wrong ones. You have seen it happen. Someone made one decision at the right moment, got more credit than your whole week. You called it luck. It was not luck, it was timing. And timing comes from patience. Patience comes from knowing that what you have does not expire, that your skill is not running out, that you can wait for the moment that matters. But waiting is not hiding. Waiting is active, building while you wait, absorbing what is in the room, knowing when the moment arrives because you paid attention while everyone else was talking. The loudest ones in any room are never fully present, too busy waiting for their turn. You are not doing that anymore. The one who does not need to be loudest is not quiet because of weakness, quiet because of control. And control takes time. It takes failure. It takes the rooms that embarrassed you, the ones that cost something real. Those rooms were not wasted. Those rooms were the training. Every time you talked too much and felt the room pull back, that was data. Every time you went silent and felt invisible, that was data too. The difference is where you aim the silence. Silence without aim is just absence. Silence aimed at the right moment is dominance. Not aggression, not manipulation, precision. Knowing when one word replaces everything else said, trusting yourself enough to wait for it, to not spend it early, to not trade it for comfort. You have traded silence for comfort before, to ease the tension, to break the quiet that scared you, to give before anyone even asked. That trade costs you every time. Not in the moment, after. In how little weight your words carried, in how easy they were to dismiss, in how quickly the room moved past. Give only what is needed, nothing past that.
You are not invisible. You are undeployed. There is a difference. Invisible means nothing is there. Undeployed means it has not been used right. The answer is not more output. It is better timing, knowing when to move and when stillness does more than motion could. The one who rushes every conversation, every decision, every chance to be seen is not moving forward, is burning out. The ones with real weight move when it matters and do not move when it does not. That discipline is not born, it is built. Line by line, decision by decision, room by room. And you are in the middle of building it, even in the rooms that hurt, even in the conversations that cost, even when you slipped, talked too much, said nothing and regretted it after. Every one of those is part of the build. Nothing is wasted if you use it as training. Nothing. What does the next version look like? Not in 10 years, in 6 months. After you drop the explanations, after you let silence sit without rushing to fill it, after you drop the performance and start just being clear. What does that room feel like when you walk in? Not working, not calculating, not holding the space with words, just there, fully there, backed by what you built. That is not a fantasy, that is a direction. That is where you point. Cut what does not serve it. Drop the reward for the noise. Give the reward to the discipline. Day after day, without applause, without confirmation, without anyone seeing the work, just you choosing it. And that choosing is where the shift starts, not in the big room, not in the important moment, in the small ones where no one is around, where you hold the word that almost came out, where you let the pause sit and trust it. Each time you do that, you add to what you are building. No one sees it yet. That's the point. The build happens in private. The result shows in public. And when it shows, it lands differently because the room can feel that it was earned. This is where the split happens, right here. The ones who get there and the ones who do not. Not skill, not talent, not the right situation. This decision to end the leak through words that were not needed, through conversations that drained without return, through rooms where you were present and performing the whole time. The ones who get there choose clarity over performance every time it is hard. Not sometimes, every time. More weight, less proving, more doing, less noise. And slowly, the rooms start to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once. Slowly. Because the ones who hold their ground without demanding to be seen build something that loud voices never can. Trust. Real trust, built quietly over time, through 1,000 small decisions that no one witnessed, but that added up. And trust is the whole thing. Not admiration, not applause. Trust. People follow trust,
not volume, not intensity, not the one who pushed hardest, the one who showed up steady, who said what was true even when it cost something, who held what was theirs even when pressure came, who did not need to win every room to know the ground was solid, build something that cannot be taken, not in the title, not in the job, not in what anyone decided to give. It is in what was chosen day after day, in the moments that did not matter. So when the right moment arrives, there is nothing to prove, only what is real, already there. And that moment will come. It always does. The question is, what will you have built by the time it arrives?
You have been measuring yourself wrong. Not by results, by how the room reacted, by whether people responded, by whether the conversation worked, by whether someone acknowledged you. And when it did not happen, you pushed harder, said more, made yourself bigger, and it still did not work. Because reaction is not the measure. Result is the measure. What actually changed, what actually moved, what actually held. You can get a reaction with noise. Anyone can do that. What you cannot fake is the result that came because you were precise, because you were patient, because you moved at the right moment and not before. That result is yours, quietly, without anyone announcing it, without anyone validating it. It is there, and you know it, and that is enough. Because real authority does not need the room to confirm what it already knows. So here's where you actually are, not where you want to be, where you are. You have real skill. You've been through hard rooms. You have carried things most will never understand. And somewhere in the process, you started performing, tried to make it visible in ways that hid it instead. That's over. Not because someone said so, because now you see it. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You'll catch yourself mid-sentence saying something not needed, and you'll pull back. Not perfectly, not every time, but more than before. And every time you pull back, instead of pushing, you add something to the build. Piece by piece, without applause, without anyone around, without anyone confirming. Just you choosing the harder thing because it is the right thing. And over time, people will not know what changed, but the room will feel it. Something is here, something steady, something that doesn't need anything from us, something worth trusting. That's when you know you stopped chasing presence. You have it. Everything you were building toward was never about getting louder. It was about becoming real. Real in the way that holds when the room shifts. Real in the way that stands when the pressure comes. You've been close, closer than you think. In the moments you held, said nothing, and it cost you, but you held. Those moments are not lost. Those moments are the foundation. Every decision after sits on what you chose in the moments no one applauded. And here's what the loudest voice in any room does not have. No foundation, no quiet weight, no discipline built in private, just volume. And volume ends when the room walks away. Yours does not end, because it was never about the room. It was always about what you chose, what you held,
what you built when no one was there. No room can take that from you. No reaction can shake it. No silence can break it. You already have it. The only question left is whether you will trust it. Drop the need for confirmation. You already know.